So the Epstein files dropped, and lots of stuff in there. Before we go on to other things, Jeffrey Epstein, amazing at email. I don't know how somebody manages to be so efficient doing like millions of emails, very, very efficient. But the bigger thing that I wanted to comment on today is a point that I heard somebody make a comment on, which is like looking at the stuff in the Epstein files, why do we even pay taxes? Like there seems like all sorts of corruption, there seems like all sorts of, all kinds of things going on. And so I wanted to spend a little bit of time on that question because, of course, here at Offshore Citizen, we deal a lot with taxes and people who, want to reduce their taxes and they're willing to move to other countries and they set up international structures. And, so we do all sorts of sophisticated tax planning to help people figure out, what can I legally do to lower my taxes using international mechanisms, whether, you're going to move to another place, you're going to have a global business structure or something like this. And so this I think does kind of fit in to some of the frustration that people feel where they think to themselves, yeah, like I'm not really so happy about this. I had a client I was talking to earlier today who has a charitable foundation, and he and I were discussing that one of the things is, look, we just don't think that the government is that good a stewards of our money. And as a result, we would rather donate it to some sort of charitable causes and distribute it ourselves, as opposed to doing so through, giving it to governments that are frankly doing all sorts of questionable things with it. So let's dive in and talk about that today. If you haven't already, please hit the subscribe button. Welcome, I'm Michael. This is Offshore Citizen. We are experts on international corporate structuring, which is, setting up companies in other countries and optimizing your global tax and your asset protection and doing international banking and getting residencies and relocating to other countries. This whole complex array of things that kind of local accountants and lawyers are not so well equipped to do because they specialize in a given country. We specialize in what happens when you move between countries. And so we have built this expertise over, I think it's about 14 years now. So myself and our team here help people with those sorts of things. And if you're interested in help with any of those things, please reach out to us. You can book a call with me, calendly.com/Michael-Rosmer, link in the description below, or send a message through offshorecitizen.net. So why do we pay taxes? I think it is worth understanding that the most basic answer to that question is taxes are a payment for protection services, okay? And in fact, it has sometimes been said that the definition of government is an organization that you pay for protection services. And the thing that I sometimes tell people is if you don't think so, try not paying them. And what you'll discover is you have to then protect yourself from them. So the protection shifts, right? There shifts from, okay, we're going to protect you to, hey, you're going to have to protect yourself from us. It's a little bit of a racket in this regard. It's a little bit like mafia type things in that regard. However, it is also true, of course, that we do need a system of protection in societies. If you don't have safety in a society, it's questionable that you have much of anything, which makes it all the more ridiculous when nations start to be nations or cities or provinces or states or whatever start to become unsafe. That's like, what am I doing? This is really nuts. The most basic thing that you guys should be doing is protecting us. And then, everything else is kind of secondary from there. And of course, there's different types of protection, right? There's physical protection, then there's sort of legal protections. There's protections, they'll say, enemies, foreign and domestic. So you've got sort of both sides. And I think that's something that we can kind of reasonably get on side with, right? If I'm being threatened, I want to have somebody that I can call who's going to come and protect me. I don't want to have to take my protection into my own hands. Generally speaking, if you get into a situation where you have private provision of protection as opposed to sort of government-driven protection, this creates very bad dynamics because those with more money will then be able to use their protective forces to not be so protective. And so you just don't want to have that situation. So the idea of a society where there is an institution that has a monopoly on violence is actually a good principle. And of course, the moment you realize that, you realize, well, we have to have some kind of shared contribution towards this shared end, and that makes sense, right? It also makes sense that there are other things that it is better to do in a kind of shared form than a personalized form. And this is in particular things where you have sort of monopolistic type resources. So roads are a good example, right? You can't have 10 different service providers sending roads into your home. You have to have a single road just because you're constrained by space. And because you're constrained by space, you need to have some sort of shared responsibility for that to make sure that it is taken care of and that somebody doesn't abuse it. And this is true of provision of water, provision of electricity. Yes, you can kind of have private groups that effectively do the maintenance on that, but ultimately it is something that is sort of protected by some sort of larger body that the people who are benefiting from those services hopefully have some sort of influence over in order to make sure that if it's abused, then there's some repercussion, right? You have some sort of an election or something like that in order to help keep this in check. So I think we can kind of agree on those sort of basic premises. Where it starts to get much more weird is as we start to look farther out and the role of government starts to expand, right? This is one of the things I think that has been a huge, huge problem in the European Union. In the European Union, you have this idea that we should have freedom of movement of people, goods, and capital. And that general idea, I think, is probably a good thing. It's, it enhances the life for the breadth of the people in the European Union. But that isn't what they stopped at, right? So then they start layering all these other things on. And there's this concept that I sometimes refer to, which is you sort of think of like will of the majority, right? So if you say, okay, I bring out proposal A, and let's just say 51% of people agree with proposal A, okay? Just say, cool, great, rule of the majority, right? Okay, so like let's keep in mind 49% of people don't like proposal A, but fair enough, okay. So now proposal B comes out. Also 51% of people. But notice that there's not 100% overlap between the people in proposal A and the people who liked proposal B. So as you layer more and more of these on, you end up in a situation where the majority of people don't agree with the majority of rules. But you kind of manage to piece it together through getting a little bit of support for each one of those. And each individual one, yes, has sufficient support, but in the aggregate, nobody who is in charge or none of the kind of bodies of rule are being broadly supported. And so I think one of the things that should have happened in the EU is they should have focused on sort of minimization of the scope of the European Union. I think it's kind of very, like organizations want to grow. So as a result, when you give people a set of power, et cetera, the natural tendency is to say, oh, well, like we've got this power, you have this power creep problem, right? This scope creep problem that shows up in project management or something like that. And so I think that's generally not good. It gets to a point where you want to kind of like cut these things down. You want to be much more efficient, but they sort of add up one on top of the other until it's impossible to get much of anything done. And that becomes very detrimental. So what was originally kind of a good idea becomes a very terrible idea. And, you could make some sort of cynical argument that, hey, that was the deliberate intention and, maybe yes, maybe no. But the effect is certainly clear one way or another. And that is quite detrimental. So you have that set of problems, which shows up. Another set of problems is you just get a lot of waste. And you can pretty easily sort of reason about how this works. I heard an interview with the guys from Stripe, somebody else and Elon Musk recently, and they were talking about this, about how in Stripe or PayPal, they're trying to prevent fraud, and they work really hard to get a 1% fraud rate. That's like really hard to achieve. And so you'd say, okay, well, if they're really working super hard at it, then they have a lot of incentive to do it really well. How much do you think the government is doing? And the answer is probably not as well, right? So there's probably a lot more fraud. We're not even talking about waste. We're just talking about fraud in this situation. And you can see in any major company, there's a lot of waste. There just is. And so as you get bigger and bigger government, a larger and larger share is waste. It's easier and easier to sort of hide. And then it becomes this sort of self-protecting mechanism. And so what's the point in paying taxes to support that? If you figure, wow, the marginal value of each dollar that I contribute is significantly less than $1, maybe I would be better off allocating that capital in some other way. Maybe that's an idea, right? And so for that reason, of course, a lot of people say, you know what, let me get out of here. Let me go somewhere else. And I think we'll talk just briefly about, can it be done better? Because I think that Some people will say, look, all the best places to live have high taxes. This is like a phrase that I've heard. Now, I think that's utter nonsense, because you can go to Singapore, where taxes are meaningfully lower than a bunch of these other places, or you can go to UAE, where there's very low taxes, or you can go to Oman or Bahrain or Hong Kong or a bunch of other places, and you can find very low taxes, and they seem to make it work. And you might say, oh yeah, but those places are small, right? It's like, well, it's very interesting to ask, just how small are we talking about here? I mean, Bulgaria has relatively low taxes. Bulgaria is not that small. I mean, UK isn't very big, and UK has pretty high taxes. New Zealand isn't very big. New Zealand has pretty high taxes. Japan isn't that huge. Japan has pretty high taxes. So I don't necessarily buy this size measure. In fact, you're going to see a lot of places that are pretty small that have pretty high taxes. So the correlation between size and efficiency in taxes doesn't seem to fit. That seems to be a misnomer that people will kind of throw out there, trying to suggest, oh, it's so easy to do this. I'm not so convinced. So then the question is, well, what is your option, right? And the answer is, oftentimes within the country that you live, there are some abilities to plan your situation to reduce the tax burden. That's one thing. And then there's an opportunity to move to other places. And there are places that are doing much better. And you can kind of vote with your feet and say, look, I don't support this stuff. I don't want to waste so much of my resources. But there's I think, the other side of it, right? Which is, what are you going to do with that money, right? Are you going to do something better with that money? Because presumably, now you might say, okay, well, listen, it's my money, right? Because it's my money, I get to do what I want with it. And there's some truth to that, right? Clearly, there's some truth to that. But there's also like a degree of stewardship, which is, if my objection is what is being done with the money is wasteful, then I think the corollary should be, okay, if I'm going to take my money and do something else with it, I should aim to do much better with it. And I think that's fair. I think that's, if a person is to move to somewhere else, they should do something good with it. I have this comment, I say, wealth is wasted on wealthy people. And I see very, very few wealthy people doing like really cool stuff with their wealth. And when I do see that, I quite appreciate it. You know, I was, had somebody at an event we were hosting back about a week ago, and they're doing some cool stuff. They're funding all sorts of really interesting research, and it's very awesome. So I would encourage people to do that, and it's something that I try to do myself. I try to kind of deploy my resources in ways that is more interesting and hopefully overall more positive than simply on raw consumption or something like this. So anyway, this is generally sort of just a high-level overview of a concept. I think that most people probably knew a lot of kind of the stuff that was going on in the Epstein files. They weren't surprised. There is obviously some like really absurd things there, but the issue is there's also some spectrum of things that's like the degree of confirmation as to what is accurate and what is not is somewhat blurred. And so hard to say how much the extremities actually play out. But certainly there's, some messed up stuff. There's a lot of messed up stuff in the world. And so it is, I think, a very good thing for people to look and to realize that what it is that is going on is simply, you shouldn't be naive to believe that, great, your Western government is like good guys and they're wonderful. There's sort of like a great gaslighting that, for example, the US gives, right? They'll say, oh, we're so worried about China going and invading Taiwan. So, well, hang on a second. How many wars has China started in the last 50 years? That's right, none. How many wars has the US started? Oh, that's right, a lot, right? Probably nobody starts more wars than the US. And so it's quite, there is a high degree of propaganda in these countries, and one would behoove themselves not to believe all that propaganda and to have a much clearer view of the fact that, no, these are fairly messed up domestic governments. And yes, by paying taxes, you are contributing to those in some way, shape, or form. And there's probably some better alternative. And if you're interested in what those alternatives are, you should reach out to us. So I hope that's helpful. And I will look forward to hearing from you. Hopefully you can reach out to us again through our website or through, you can book a with me on Calendly. And I look forward to seeing you on the next video.